Hey folks, good to be back with you. Doc Patterson here. Our lesson today comes from Luke chapter 5, first 11 verses, and it's a lesson that seems to concentrate on the notion of obedience. Obedience is one of those virtues that seems to be lost today. We're just not a very obedient people these days, I think, and so it's worth looking at this passage of scripture because Luke hits about four different facets regarding obedience that I think we need to pay attention to. And the first facet is that of nonsense. Sometimes obedience just seems like nonsense. Let me tell you what happened to me several years back. I got a chance to go to a workshop at St. Paul School of Theology with Tex Sample. He was a professor of church and society out there. I went out, I was excited about getting all this wonderful information from Tex. It was a 4-day workshop, a very intensified workshop. I went in it for the first day. I was excited about it. I was ready to go. I had all my tools ready in order to be able to record everything that he was going to impart to us through the course of our time together. He came in, introduced himself, and told us a few things about him. And then he started around the room asking the same thing of all the students there. And there were a lot of students gathered from this for this workshop from all over the nation. He would ask us our name, and he would say, what are your hobbies, or what are you interested in doing? How do you spend your time? You know, that kind of thing. And after he got through with doing that with a few people, he started moving people around. He would say to this person, I want you to move over there into that seat, and I want you to come over here this way. And he kept doing that as he went through the entire class. I mean, this is like a 45-minute deal, at least 45-minute deal. I thought it was absolute nonsense. People getting up. He moved some people 2 or 3 different times. When he came to me, he asked me my name, asked me what my hobbies were. I responded to him. And he said, all right, Mr. Patterson, I'd like for you to move over here into this chair right over here on my left side. I thought it was nonsense. But I did it. I obeyed. And you know why I did it? Because he was the teacher and I was the student. Or in Luke's words in this passage, he was the master and I was under his authority. That is the dynamic that we see in this episode of Jesus' life. Jesus has traveled back to Capernaum from Nazareth. He's already been to Capernaum once. And due to his increasing popularity as a teacher, as a rabbi, a crowd has gathered around him there on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And they apparently have asked Jesus to teach them about the scriptures, and he complies. Now, near where he is standing, there's 2 boats. One of them belongs to the Jonas boys, Peter and Andrew, and one of them belongs to the Zebedee boys, James and John. Well, in order to get what I would call a better lectern position, he says to Peter, let's get in the boat. I want you to take me just a little offshore in your boat so I can teach the people from there. Well, you got to know that Peter thinks this request is nonsense. They've been out in that boat all night long fishing. They've already pulled it into shore. They've beached the boat. They've swabbed her down inside and out. They're busy cleaning their nets. And this request makes no sense to Peter at all. Jesus can teach just as easily from the shoreline. But Peter does it. He obeys. And you know why he obeys? Because Jesus is the master and Peter is under his authority. Well, after Jesus finished the lecture, he told Peter to put out into deep water and let down the nets. Let's go fishing, he says. Again, you got to know, Peter thinks this is absolute nonsense. Peter, Andrew, the rest of the crew, they've been out all night. They hadn't caught one fish. The fish weren't biting. These guys were weary to the bone. They were hungry, and they just wanted to go home. But Peter said, okay, if you want to go fishing, we'll go fishing. Why did he do it? Because Jesus is the master, and he was under his authority. You see, the thing about obedience is that it doesn't matter whether or not you think the boss's order makes sense. What matters is whether or not you do it. Obedience, as I've said, is one of the lost virtues of our day. We have developed such a large sense of personal entitlement in our society that we think whether or not we do what's asked of us is based on what we personally think about it. If my opinion is that your request as the boss doesn't make sense, then I shouldn't have to do it. That seems to be the pervading attitude through our society today. I know a man in his early 60s who is the embodiment of this entitlement perspective. He's disobeyed with every boss he's ever had. Subsequently, he's been fired from every significant job he's ever had. And his life now is bereft of satisfaction. Satisfaction, I think it's one of the most overlooked and underappreciated gifts that we get from the Master, satisfaction. Do you want your life to be satisfying? Do you? Do you want to enjoy a sense of purpose and meaning and significance in your life? If you do, I would suggest that you discover anew the virtue of obedience in all of your relationships. A little obedience between you and your friends, between you and your spouse, and most importantly, with the Master, would go a long way to improving your life. Well, this takes us to the second facet of obedience that we see in this episode of Jesus' life, and that is, how do you measure obedience? Well, seemingly from this story, it's measured in two ways. First of all, Peter did everything the Master asked him to do. He didn't do any of it halfway. He did it all. There is no such thing, Luke implies, as 50% obedience. If you do just some or just a part of what the boss wants you to do, then you haven't done what he wants you to do. If I ask a mechanic to fix the generator on my van so I can drive it, and he takes it off and fixes it, but doesn't put it back on the van, then I can't drive my van, and he hasn't done what I asked him to do. There is no such thing as 50% obedience. Of course, we all struggle with that. We do. We want to be obedient, or at least some of us want to be obedient, but we have our human failings. Aren't you glad for God's redeeming grace, even in the midst of some of our disobedience? Well, I'll let that stew for a while. The second way that obedience is measured in this episode in Jesus' life is what I call full nets. Peter was obedient, and they caught fish. They caught so many fish that they were afraid the boats were going to sink if they pulled the nets into the boats. Obedience to the Master always leads to a net full of satisfaction. Like obedience, there is no such thing as 50% satisfaction. I believe satisfaction, as I've already said, is one of the most overlooked gifts that we can get from the Master. Listen to me. because I'm going to tell you something here that's true, and you need to ponder this. That satisfaction that you get from that first wonderful smelling, fresh, hot, black, liquid gold cup of coffee in the morning is the same satisfaction you get from climbing to the top of 14,000 foot tall Electric Peak in Colorado. I know, I did it. My friend and mentor, one of my mentors, Bert Hillman, once told me, he said, Patterson, if I die tomorrow, I'll be a satisfied man. You know why? And I said, why is that, Bert? He said, because I did with my life what Jesus asked me to do. Well, a third facet of obedience that we see in this passage of Scripture is that of unworthiness. You know, when Peter saw the nets filled with fish, he knew that Jesus was bigger, grander, had a greater sense of magnitude to his presence and being than any other human being he had ever encountered. And he felt unworthy. He was in the presence of the holy. And Luke says that Peter fell down at Jesus' knees and said, I wish you would just go away from me, Lord. There's no way I can stack up to you. I'm just a sinful man, a mere human being, and you're amazing. This reminds me of the story of Isaiah, who, when God called him into his service, felt so unworthy that he said, woe is me. I am completely undone because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of a people of unclean lips. Both Isaiah and Peter felt the magnitude of their unworthiness in the presence of the Master. That's the third facet of obedience in this story. Unworthiness. Look, folks, none of us is worthy of being called into the service of the Master. We all have our failings. We all have our limits. We're all just mere humans. We're all just common, ordinary people. But that seems to be who the Master likes to work with. Ordinary people. He took Isaiah and cleaned up his lips with a burning coal. And then he took Peter and he said, Peter, don't be afraid. You now work for me. And that brings us to the fourth facet of obedience that we find in this episode of Jesus' life. And that is mystery. Jesus takes ordinary persons who have to work hard at being obedient to the Master. Ordinary persons like you and me. And he adds a little more ordinary to it. And somehow he comes up with extraordinary disciples and servants in the building of the kingdom. Extraordinary people. I don't know how it works. It's a mystery. It's part of the greater mystery of faith. I don't know how it works, but I know this. I know it does indeed work. Let me sum it up by saying this. Obedience to the Master, whether or not it makes sense to you, is the gracious net that is filled with satisfaction for ordinary, unworthy folk like you and me. I don't know how it works. I just know it does. We'll see you next time.